I think we can jump right into it. Welcome to the 6th Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange Program. This one is focused on how you can reduce emissions through renewable energy purchasing. My name is John Cleveland, and along with my colleague Amy Longsworth, we staff the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. As many of you know, GRCx is our interactive virtual program series designed to support our mission of accelerating a city's CAP implementation by providing high quality, useful content on climate resilience and carbon mitigation. Most of you know that the city is in the process, as part of their CAP update, of designing a building energy reporting and disclosure ordinance, BERDO 2.0, that will focus on mandatory emission reductions for carbon neutrality by 2050. And as part of this ordinance, renewable energy procurement will become a critical strategy for improving a building's path to compliance under the standard. We, the GRC, with our multiple working groups, have been supporting our members in understanding how to do renewable energy purchasing since about 2015, when we brought together the Renewable Energy Purchasing Network. As part of that, we also supported a Renewable Energy Leadership Prize that stimulated a large number of real estate transactions, including the largest multi-owner PPA done in the US at the time, included MIT, Boston Medical Center, Post Office Square was facilitated by ABC. And as part of this process, we have produced several information products. So if you could go to the next slide, Lizzie. Okay, maybe the next one. Just wanted to highlight these for you. We will put the links to these reports in the chat box so you have access to them. They're on our website, but we'll give you direct links. So the first is an overview of institutional renewable energy purchasing options, and it's specific, to the state of Massachusetts. The second, which was led by Harvard University in collaboration with Meister Consultants Group, dove into the details of what guidance for making claims, associated environmental claims related to different kinds of purchasing arrangements. And the last report was an overview of the Renewable Energy Leadership Prize itself and how it stimulated organizations and institutions to move forward. Part of the reason we put these materials together is one of the things that we found with the Renewable Energy Purchasing Network is that a major barrier to doing renewable energy deals was not the availability of good deals or the economics or the opportunity for emission reductions, but they were internal organizational barriers to simply understanding how the process worked and what the different options were and how those could align with a strategy within the organization. So the purpose of this program is to explore those questions, and we're going to be using the Boston University wind PPA as a practical example. The reason we chose this day and this time is on this day, December 1st, 2020, a wind farm being built by NG North America is actually launching into operation, and the turbines are starting to move, and that will produce 205 million kilowatts of electricity annually for BU, which is 100% of its electricity load. So we have a great panel that's going to lead us through this process. Alison Brizius, that pretty much all of you know in one way or another, who's the Director of Climate Environmental Planning, is going to kick us off and is going to talk specifically about how renewable energy procurement fits into the design of the planned building emissions performance standards, or how they're thinking about doing that. The next two panelists both worked with BU as partners, consulting partners, as BU put its procurement together. Henry is the environmental impact analyst with WattTime, and he's going to review the strategies for identifying renewable purchasing options that maximize emissions reduction. His expertise is emissions-focused load shifting, energy storage optimization, and renewable energy siting to maximize avoided emissions. Actually, some of the practices are really unique and really varied, and I think you'll find them really interesting. Kristen is the VP of Renewable Analytics Advisories at Edison Energy, and she's going to lead us through the sometimes very arcane details of how you structure a transaction that's aligned with your organizational goals, what many of the options are, and what kind of process you can use to choose between them. And then finally, Dennis, who most of you know, is the Associate VP for Sustainability at Boston University, who really heads up their climate work and led their climate action planning process. He's going to walk us through the process that BU used internally to assess its opportunities and make decisions on the final transactions that fit and align with their climate plan and their climate goals. We will end with 25 minutes of Q&A. And if you have questions as the panelists do their presentation, please put your questions in the chat box, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. But we'll be using the chat box as opposed to a hand raise or other kind of process to get to the questions and get those done. A reminder that we are recording this session, and shortly after this session, you will get an email with a link to the recording and to the slide deck that was used, and will include a link to a short survey to give us feedback on the GRCx program and how we can improve. Final admonition is please mute yourselves if you're not in a speaking mode. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Alison to give us the framing of renewable energy purchasing and how it fits into the emerging building emissions performance standard. Alison?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'd first like to give a little bit of a brief context of how we got to a performance standard, and then, as John said, I'm going to talk about how renewable energy procurement fits into the solution here. Next. So Boston has a history of climate action. The city has a long track record and a commitment to protecting our built and natural environment and addressing the threat of climate change, going back to our first climate action plan in 2007. Next. However, since Mayor Walsh took office, we've recognized that we have a moral and an ethical obligation to decarbonize our city. We must actively stop contributing to the problem that has got us to this point. That's why much of our recent work on climate change has been guided by the mayor's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2050. Next. A little bit of the context here. I think, as we all know, and as was highlighted in the most recent IPCC report, we must drastically and quickly reduce our emissions if we're to avert the worst impacts of climate change. Next. We know we're already seeing the impacts today. This picture is from the storms in 2018, where we saw firsthand flooding with storm surge and some sea level rise. We know that that will only increase in the future, and that but for the luck of high tides, we would have seen much more drastic impacts from storms such as Sandy, or will see in storms in the future. Next. That's why Mayor Walsh has committed us to a resilient harbor vision, right? An opportunity to protect the city from increased storm surge, sea level rise, and flooding, while maintaining our access to the coast and to open space. This is a plan that we've spent many years and invested millions of dollars in beginning to build out. And it's a plan that we have billions yet to invest to protect the city. But this work will ultimately not be effective unless we reduce and stop the emissions at their source. Next. We also know that this is about much more than just infrastructure and buildings and assets. First and foremost, this is about the people of Boston. It's about protecting our residents from the impacts of climate change. Next. And it's also about protecting the most vulnerable. We see here in COVID and disasters of this nature, how important it is and how impacted our frontline communities are by the effects and stresses of a disaster like this. And we know that they will be the first and most impacted by climate change. This is why they must be at the forefront of our action as we work work to reduce our emissions. Next. I also want to talk about how we're not alone in this, right? There are hundreds of cities across the country, as well as across the world, that are actively working to meet this need to reduce our emissions across the nation. Next. And building performance standards, like the one we're going to be talking about more today, have been identified as one of the most impactful strategies that we can pursue to achieve this goal. In black here are cities that already have some form of performance standard enacted, and in blue are the cities and counties that are actively pursuing its development. Next. We also know how important it is as we recover from the COVID crisis to be building back to our goals and our vision, to building a healthy, resilient, equitable, and thriving Boston. And we see the performance standard is one more opportunity to be building towards those goals and not back to business as usual. Next. So briefly, let me remind you where we are in our emissions reduction process. So here on the right, you see our emissions reductions tracked over time. We began tracking in about 2005, and we've been reducing our emissions steadily. The red line represents our earlier goal of 25% emissions reduction by 2020. And the gold line is our goal if we were to just pursue a straight line to carbon neutrality by 2050. You can see that we have been making progress, but we need to drastically accelerate the scale and the speed of our work. You can also see on the left side that buildings contribute about 70% of the emissions in the city of Boston, and large buildings contribute slightly over 50% of those emissions. That's a lot of the motivation behind why we're tackling this emissions performance standard for large buildings first. Go ahead, next. So it's important to not just have the goal and achieve emissions reduction, but to understand really what it takes to get there. That's why, with the help of the Green Ribbon Commission and the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy and experts across the city, we undertook a comprehensive study of Boston's emissions and different pathways that would get us to carbon neutrality. We used that rigorous analysis to drive the update of our climate action plan in 2019 and worked with stakeholders across the city to identify those critical actions that would get us on the path to carbon neutrality in the next 5 years. Next. So here are the first 7 actions in the climate action plan, the ones that focus on buildings. And today we're going to talk about number 5, developing a carbon emission performance standard to decarbonize existing large buildings. There's a number of others that I'd love to talk to you in more detail about at another opportunity, from action the city's taking to lead by example to decarbonize our own buildings, to the ecosystem of workforce development and green job opportunities we see that will help us achieve these goals, and our need to work together at a broader scale to advocate with our surrounding communities and at the state level to make sure that all of our standards and goals are aligned to achieve this goal. Go ahead, next. Next. So I just wanted to also highlight that there's a number of other supportive actions that are identified in the plan. We're not going to get to decarbonized buildings without a whole bunch of other work in addition to this standard, right? The standard will set the targets, but we're going to be building out and working with all of you on exploring and expanding financing mechanisms, on workforce development programs, on piloting new technologies and the like. So this really is about developing and expanding that ecosystem. Next. So why a performance standard? There are many reasons for a performance standard, but one of the primary ones is that it directly targets our largest source of emissions. This would be not targeting energy efficiency, although that would be an important strategy to achieve it, but this would be about setting binding carbon equivalent GHG emissions reduction targets over time. We also intend to set long planning horizons so that people can build this into their own existing natural capital planning cycles, and to create flexibility in how to meet the targets and when they make new investments. We understand that each building is unique and that each context is unique. And we know that technology is evolving and rapidly changing. So we do not want to set prescriptive technology specific targets. We want to instead set a performance standard and allow buildings to identify the best strategies and combinations of strategies to achieve those goals. Next. We also think it's important in developing the standard to be aware of and to take opportunities to enhance the additional benefits that come with a policy of this nature. The opportunity to create healthier buildings where we live and work, to reduce energy bills for our residents, and to maximize the opportunity for construction and renewable energy job opportunities across the city. Next. So I'd like to briefly walk through some of the key policy elements, and then I'm going to jump ahead to where renewable procurement fits in. Next. So throughout the policy development process, we've been tackling a lot of different elements of development of a performance standard, from the coverage level. So what buildings would be covered by this performance standard, what size, what type, to how to achieve and set the targets, setting them by use type as opposed to square footage or other strategies, so that we can accurately represent and understand and take account of the fact that buildings have many different uses and those require different targets. A hospital is a very different building type than a multifamily residential building or a storage facility. We want to take account of that in building the targets. We also want to make sure that the targets are aligned with our broader city goals of 50% reduction by 2030 from our 2005 baseline and achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. Also, of course, we want to talk about, in addition to energy efficiency, which we hope will be one of the core strategies of achieving these targets, we want to talk about opportunities for procurement of renewable electricity through RECs, PPAs, and Boston Community Choice Energy. And we're going to spend a little bit of time, and we're happy to have so many great speakers telling us about the details of those opportunities later today. Next. So options to achieve the targets. We'll be setting targets that are emissions targets per building type per square foot. Go ahead, next. But how we achieve those targets, or how a building achieves those targets, is up to whatever their own assessment of their building, what makes sense for their building. And it can be a combination of many factors. Obviously, great opportunities for energy efficiency, from insulation to upgrading systems to better controls and operations. Opportunities for fuel switching from systems that use more carbon intensive fuel sources to those that use cleaner fuel sources. And then, of course, renewable energy. Especially for these largest buildings, renewable energy is going to be a core component of the strategy. They won't all achieve net zero or carbon neutrality on site. Off-site renewable energy is going to have to be part of the solution and should be part of the solution for these buildings. So within the policy, we're looking at 3 primary strategies that would be allowed for renewable energy procurement. You're going to have a lot more detail that you'll gain from the next speakers on the treatment of RECs and opportunities for power purchase agreements. But I'd like to briefly touch on community choice energy before we move on. I would just say that we are throughout the process looking to set some basic fundamental criteria that all forms of renewable energy procurement would achieve. So for example, strategies we're considering include setting requirements for the actual retirement of the RECs associated with any of these projects, identifiability, so knowing where the RECs are coming from, obviously setting some requirements about the time period in which the RECs are procured and retired, and then discussions around the types of RECs that would be allowable via, say, from non-emitting sources as an example of some of those criteria. So if we could go next, I'd like to briefly talk about community choice electricity. So community choice electricity is a program that the city is soon to launch that we believe will not only help lower emissions across the city, but give residents greater control over the electricity that powers their lives and their communities. It will lower emissions, it will create more renewable energy, and it will protect our vulnerable populations and increase consumer confidence by creating price stability and protecting residents from some of the more competitive electricity suppliers out there that can, not all, but some can adopt predatory practices that we want to make sure that residents are not locked into. So with Community Choice Energy, we'll be launching it soon. I just wanted to highlight here some of the guiding principles that have driven our work in this area. Beginning in October 2018, the Boston Community Choice Electricity Working Group collaborated with the city to develop these principles and values for the program, and they've served as the foundation for the design of the program and the choices we've made in selecting the products. I think you'll see some of these mirrors your choices that you can apply to your own procurements. Could be guided by a set of principles, these or others that fit your particular context. Next. So here's a little bit of a history of the program. This is a history starting recently when we were finally approved by the DPU to be launching the program. We're targeting a start of the program in February, and we're expecting to have an announcement about the details of that program in the very near future. So please stay tuned. This would cover at least around 250,000 households and businesses that are on the basic service class of electricity right now. Residents would be able to opt out, opt in, or opt up at any time. So that would be a protected flexibility that they would have. We're seeking to ensure, again, price stability, price transparency, and to increase the amount of renewables as much as possible, depending on the bids that we get. And achieving those simultaneous goals. So for renewables, we are in this procurement only seeking mass class 1 RECs from sources that don't produce GHG emissions. We need to talk just a little bit about the potential here. We see that with these 250,000 households and businesses, they generate on average 1.7 terawatt hours of electricity annually. So even just a few percent more in renewables into that mix would create very substantial emissions reductions. And as we're able to add more and more, the opportunity will only grow from there. So we see this as a great strategy for residents that are participating that may live in buildings that would be covered by the performance standard, as well as residents across the city, but opting in, staying in the program, or opting up to 100% or some higher level of renewables will be an important way that they can contribute to reducing the emissions of their building throughout the standard. So next, I realize I'm running a little bit long here. I just wanted to give you a quick overview, and you can have this later, of the timeline of the standard development, and offer that if anyone is interested in participating in the stakeholder process and learning more about the standard development as we round the turn into December and are creating a final policy proposal, please reach out. Happy to talk to you about your building, or as a resident or as a building owner, or just as an interested party and a resident of Boston about the details here. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the speakers about the details of our additional procurement options within the policy here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alison. Hey, one quick question before we turn it over to Henry. Are there, in the way you're thinking now, will there be any constraints on the types of power purchase agreements that do or do not qualify for compliance with the standard as we go into this discussion with BU and the team?
Sure. So we're still finalizing those requirements, but where we're considering right now is that the power purchase agreements would need to be long-term, right? So more than a year or two, which I think is generally a characteristic of most large-scale power purchase agreements, that the RECs would need to be retired, right? So if the RECs will be attributed to the emissions reduction for the building, they shouldn't be resold. They would be retired, or if they are resold, then a REC at least as good as the REC requirements for the policy would be achieved. And right now we're considering mass class 1 RECs for the policy. So you'd need basically a mass class 1 or better quality REC to be to be retired there. So ideally the RECs from the power purchase agreement. We're not right now looking to geographically constrain the power purchase agreement other than attached to the US grid in some way or the New England grid.
Okay, great. Thanks. Really appreciate that. Henry, going to turn it over to you now.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Henry with WattTime. We're a nonprofit really focused on understanding the electric grid in great detail. And on the next slide, I just wanted to, in this presentation, I really wanted to give an overview of how renewable energy actually reduces emissions and the mechanism by which that occurs. But this quick overview slide is kind of moving from that net zero energy framework to an emissions framework, understanding that not all kilowatt hours have the same effect. And so in this example, you have a building in California, in this case, that consumes this much electricity, and you can go out and procure that same amount of electricity in California, or in this example, Virginia. And so on an annual basis, it's net zero. It produces as much electricity as it consumes on an annual basis. But as you start to drill down into that on the right side, you have that same building in California causes that much emissions in the dark green bar, but the solar panels that kind of produce that same quantity of electricity only displaces 3/4 of the same amount of emissions because it's forcing off cleaner resources when other solar is producing in California. And so you can see that timing aspect is really important. And so there's a timing piece here where when you produce electricity really matters. And then if you take that same amount of electricity, instead of producing it in California, you actually produce it in Virginia, you can begin to see that it displaces 2.5 times the amount of emissions because of the types of resources it's displacing. Instead of displacing natural gas and solar in California, it's displacing primarily coal. So you're doubling the benefit of that renewable energy. And on the next slide, I just really want to emphasize the timing aspect of this. You want to avoid those peaks of emissions. You want to consume as little electricity as possible in the peaks and move it as much as possible into the troughs on the left side. And so that's the timing aspect. If you have flexible devices or if you're designing a building, you want to take advantage of that. And on the next slide really talks about the geographic differences. So because of the different mixes in different grids and different resources, when you build a renewable energy power plant, it displaces different resources. You want to focus your investments in those places that have the most benefit. And if you're building something, and if you have locational flexibility, you want to build in the clean places if possible. New England, parts of Canada, California. And so you're really taking advantage of the clean resources. That works well if you're building data centers or something like that. But if you're building a building, you're often stuck where you are. On the next slide, I really want to talk about the exact mechanism by which a resource actually displaces, a new renewable energy generator displaces a fossil resource. This is actually called a dispatch stack, and it represents all of the different resources in a grid region. So you have your renewables over here on the left, then you have a mix of other different resources kind of up the stack, and each bar represents a different resource and the price it will bid into the market. So for example, if demand is high somewhere over here in the gray, all of the resources before that will need to run to meet that demand in a region. And that edge resource is actually called the marginal resource. So as demand shifts, different resources on that edge turn on and off. And if you look at the next slide, you actually start to see, if you have that kind of same chart here on the left, and that the dark arrow is in the same location, but the difference between the chart shows we've actually added a new renewable resource on the right side in the box. And that's shifted the whole chart over. You can see it's falling off the side, and everything in gray box no longer needs to run. So you've displaced that marginal resource or avoided the emissions from that resource. So that is kind of the key insight is when you build a new resource, it pushes off other resources, and what you push off is really important and varies by region. On the next slide, we're actually showing we don't actually use a kind of a perfect dispatch stack because not all markets operate smoothly. We use an empirical model to detect which resource is responding to that change in load. So we know when you add a new generation, you're changing the resource mix. How do emissions change? Which power plants turn off in response to that? And we chart that by different balancing authorities and ISOs. For example, ISO New England controls the grid in New England and decides which power plants turn on and off. So we track it at that geographic granularity. On the next slide, I really want to launch into like how you integrate this into your process for assessing different projects. There are two components which we think are really important. The first, which we're not getting into much here, is additionality. So, and that's the concept of when you make an investment, how much new renewable energy do you cause to be built? What is the impact of your investment? And that's a critical component. And different types of investment can have different levels of additionality. Like unbundled RECs from Texas, if you invest in them, may not actually cause new renewable energy to be built, so it has low additionality. But if you're engaging in a PPA, your financial assurances are enabling that new project to be built. So there's kind of a scale of additionality. And then on the other side is the kind of displaced emissions, which we're talking about more so here, which is now that you've invested in a resource, what other grid generators is that resource displacing? And so we think that that avoided emissions component is very important. And so on the next slide, we actually show, as part of the procurement process, so BU went out and asked for a bunch of, put out an RFP for a bunch of different projects and received responses. And what we did was we compared the relative avoided emissions of all those different projects and said, okay, BU could invest in a project in New England, or it could invest in a project in a different location. And what is the avoided emissions of all the different projects that they could consider? And then comparing those different avoided emissions, say, can we prioritize projects that reduce emissions more than others? And then taking that information on the next slide, that was integrated into a decision matrix where, in addition to the financial criteria, so ensuring that it met the risk requirements, the project met certain avoided emissions requirements as well. Like, what can we maximize the avoided emissions that this project is achieving? And so on the next slide, we're essentially advocating for a general process by which people who are procuring renewable energy don't procure renewable energy in the place where it has lesser impact, but prioritize those regions where when you build new renewable energy, it's displacing the dirtiest resources. So maybe solar in California doesn't make so much sense anymore. We already have so much. Build that solar somewhere else in the country, the Midwest, Appalachia. Don't build wind farms in Quebec. They're already 100% hydro. Build those wind farms where you can displace dirtier resources. And so there's a huge opportunity here. A lot of organizations, educational organizations, corporate, a bunch of different institutions are considering renewable energy procurement. And so we're advocating that they procure that in the highest impact locations. So that kind of covers how new renewable energy resources actually cause emissions reductions. There are a couple other things on the next slide that we think are kind of where this is all going. Once you're within a region, there are different times throughout the day when different dirty resources or clean resources are turning on and off. For example, in New England, there's wind curtailment at certain times at night. So if you were to increase demand, then you wouldn't cause any additional emissions, and you can avoid that evening peak when all the dirty peaker plants are turning on. And so automatic load flexibility in devices. So if you can automatically shift when your EV charges, automatically shift when your smart thermostat consumes electricity. And so we think that's kind of one of the interesting futures of grid responsive devices. And then on the next slide, kind of harking back to what Alison was talking about, on the next slide, we have we understand that we talked about how it displaces CO2. CO2 is a global pollutant. It doesn't matter where it's emitted, it affects globally. But other criteria pollutants have a significant health impact. So if you can invest in a renewable energy project that displaces a resource in a heavily populated area with vulnerable populations, you'll have a significantly larger benefit for health in that environment, on that population. So we're starting to track and think about how do you measure the health impacts of a new renewable energy investment or by shifting load. Can you consume electricity at times when it doesn't impact those populations? And it really matters where those power plants are. So it adds a layer of complexity, not only the time, but also the location of those generators. And we think this is a very important area of ongoing research. And that's everything for me on the next slide. And I'll pass it off to Kristen.
Great, thanks, Henry. It's just really fascinating listening to you and understanding all the different kinds of calculations that you can make. I think it's not part of most of us, you know, non-deep PPA geeks framework for thinking about this. So appreciate that, and appreciate the role that WattTime is playing in this market. I'm sure there will be lots of questions that will get into the next level of detail, but now I'm going to turn it over to Kristen. Kristen, you're up.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Kristen Blum. I lead the renewables practice at Edison Energy, and what we do is we help commercial, industrial clients, as well as universities, really any non-utility buyers buy energy. And my group is really focused on the options for renewables. So if we go to the next slide, I'll start to explain what some of those options are. So these are options that many buyers use to meet their scope 2 emissions, to address their electricity purchasing with renewables. And these really vary depending on what the client is trying to accomplish, the size of the client, their budget, their risk tolerance, and where they're located. So, typically most clients will use a combination of these as well. There's really no one size kind of fits your entire portfolio. You're going to want to manage what your options are that are available to you and the economics and risks associated with these different options. And so for REC purchases, many of you are probably aware of this, these are the environmental attributes from projects, and you can buy them unbundled. So they're really like buying a piece of paper, a commodity that says, I bought 1 megawatt hour of green energy. You don't need to buy the energy with it. And those are available at any scale and across the country. You can typically buy them from anywhere in the United States and apply them to your load at any facility. On-site solar, this will really vary by where you're located and what the options are. Tends to be something that can be done at a pretty small scale. As you see here, this is kind of just general framework, but you can do it from kilowatts all the way up to a few megawatts, depending on the land you have available in the resource. Community solar is a program that's available only in a few states, but Massachusetts actually has a really great program that I'll describe in a little bit more detail. And this allows you to participate in solar in your community, but not necessarily at your facility. Green tariffs not as applicable here because we have a deregulated region. The other then being offsite renewable energy, which you can buy within the New England ISO, or you can also do that outside as BU did in another ISO for reasons that we'll get into and that Henry described. These typically tend to be purchases that need to be larger in scale. So if you're a smaller building, it may not make sense to do your own PPA. If you're kind of mid-level, you may aggregate with others to get that scale. And if you're a large buyer, then you can sign your own power purchase agreement. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to dive into RECs. So go one more. So as I mentioned, these are really certificates that you can apply to your electricity usage from a renewable energy project. And the way that they're done is very clear from an accounting standpoint. So you purchase these RECs typically on an annual basis. You can do it on a longer term basis, but the nice thing about RECs is that they're very flexible. You can buy them at the end of the year to cover the load once you have a sense of your electricity usage for that year. You get the certificate in a tracking system that makes sure it's not being double counted. You retire it and you apply it to your electricity usage. The benefits of RECs are that they are very easy. They're easy to transact. The contracts are very short. They're standardized. The challenge, as Henry mentioned, is that they're typically not causing additionality. So it's a project that's already operating. You are claiming those environmental attributes, but you're not necessarily helping to bring new renewables onto the grid. They tend to be pretty low in cost if you're buying a national REC. They tend to be more expensive, which we'll see on the next slide, if you're buying them in places like New England, where we have an RPS program that increases the price because you're competing with utilities to buy those RECs. If you want to go to the next slide. So here's just a snapshot, and obviously these markets are always changing, of what RECs cost depending on where you are. So if you're looking to do a more cost-effective REC, you're probably going to source them from a place like Texas, where there's a lot of projects that are generating, that are off of their PPAs, and can sell those RECs pretty cheaply. Although we are starting to see more demand in that market, and the price is really starting to tick up as more buyers are looking to buy these certificates. This would be much more cost-effective than buying it, let's say, in New England, where the REC prices can be quite expensive for tier 1 RECs. but you're not getting that local impact. So if you're looking to support renewables in New England, that comes with a premium, but that may be something important for your organization. But the key here is that typically if you're just buying the REC, you are not causing new projects to come online. You're not necessarily having the carbon impact that you may be wanting to do as an organization. You're also subject to how these costs could change over time, and they can be quite volatile because they're really driven by regulation as opposed to sort of liquid markets such as energy markets. So next slide. So then moving on to community solar, you can go one more slide. This is a program in Massachusetts that's available to both residential and commercial buyers. And really what you're doing here is you're signing a solar PPA, but as opposed to the typical transaction that we'll talk about for an offsite purchase, you're getting a discount on your utility bill. So you sign the solar PPA, you pay the PPA price, that solar is actually sold to the utility, and the utility gives you a discount on your electricity bill. The positive is that you can get really a guaranteed savings over the life of the contract. And these are long contracts. They typically are 15 to 20 years in length. So you need to have some commitment that you're going to have facilities in Massachusetts for that period of time. You don't get that guaranteed savings or kind of guaranteed economics when you sign an offsite PPA. So that is really a benefit of the community solar program. Plus you are bringing renewables into the state of Massachusetts and supporting local goals. The challenge is that the utility does keep the REC because that's what they need to be in compliance with this program. So if you're looking to do this for your scope 2 emissions, you will likely need to still buy RECs, and you can get those replacement RECs often in the contract with the developer. They might source them from Texas or another place so that you can still make your renewable energy claims, but they're slightly different claims than buying the REC from the project that you have a PPA with. So next slide. And I'll probably leave this, you can read through these details. The key thing I'd say here is that this is a very popular program and the incentive does decline over time. So it's something of interest to your company or your institution. You should look into it pretty soon so that you can get the access to the higher incentive blocks before they start to decline. Moving on to the next slide. So then the other option you're hearing a lot more about, which is what Boston University pursued, is a power purchase agreement. And these can be both financially settled or sometimes called virtual, where you're not actually taking the physical electricity and using it at your facility. You're really doing a financial transaction where that electricity is put into the grid and you are matching it with the amount of electricity that you're using at your facility. And that can be in a totally different grid, depending on what you're looking to accomplish. Or it can be physically delivered, where you actually are having that tied to the retailer who's delivering your electricity to your facility. And being in New England, you actually have the option to do physical delivery. There's lots of places in the United States where it's all regulated. You can only buy from your local utility. There is choice in Massachusetts, so it's something that's an option. Again, you do need to have a larger scale typically to make the economics work for these types of transactions. And they are more complicated in the sense that you do need to negotiate an agreement and really look at the economics that you're taking on. So next slide. So these are increasing in popularity, and largely that is because they allow companies and institutions to get significant amount of scale. If you're doing on-site solar, you're a large company or a large institution, you can maybe get a couple percentages towards your goal, but if you're really looking to hit 100% carbon neutrality, you typically have to do off-site renewables to get there. This was started by a lot of the large tech companies, the data center companies, but we're really seeing a lot more companies and institutions participating, universities, consumer brands, industrials. We work with many clients across all of these spectrums. And Edison Energy alone has helped on about 6 gigawatts of PPAs at this point, to give you a sense of scale with these types of non-utility buyers. So the market is growing significantly. In terms of the claims that you're making, PPAs is a little bit the gold standard. You are typically signing with a new build facility. It has not been built yet. So by you signing a power purchase agreement, you're allowing them to get access to financing to build the project, meaning that you are bringing new renewables onto the grid with your commitment. So very strong sustainability story. Depending on where you sign the agreement, it can also be structured as a hedge on your electricity purchasing or your natural gas purchasing. So it can be used as a risk mitigation tool, although it has to be properly structured to do that. The negative is that these are long-term agreements and you're typically taking on energy market risk. So you really do need to understand, have an advisor, have someone help you understand the economics and make sure that's an appropriate risk for your institution to take on. Next slide. So what you see here on the left in the map are the regions that are deregulated at the wholesale level in the United States. So these are regions where a market is run to set the wholesale electricity price. These are locations where you can sign a virtual power purchase agreement, because you really do need to have that wholesale market to set the price so that you can do the swap between a PPA price and a wholesale price, which is how a financial PPA is settled. So you can sign a transaction in any of these regions financially. What's on the right are states where you can sign a physical PPA, where you can actually have that power from the renewable project delivered to your location. And as you can see in Massachusetts, we have that option. There are reasons I'll get into in a few minutes why people are not doing them as much here as other regions, and really that's economic, as well as the carbon impact, as Henry mentioned. But it is feasible to do any type of transaction in this region because it's fully deregulated. Next slide. So why would you pick certain regions to do your PPA? Would you think about doing it in Massachusetts, or would you think about doing it in a different state? And Henry touched on one of the main reasons, which is the carbon reduction impact that your purchase will have. And because that's largely what companies are doing this for, that could be a large motivating factor. Additional things you need to think about is the economics. Those tend to be the two things, the sustainability impact and the economics. As you can see here on the left, this is the solar resource across the United States, and on the right is the wind resource across the United States. So as you can see, with solar, which tends to be increasing in popularity for economic reasons, Massachusetts is not the best place to site solar, just because we don't have the resource that other places in the United States have. We also have a much higher cost of land, and it's more difficult to develop here because it is a more populated area, as opposed to some of these states that have very open land. It becomes much cheaper. On the wind side, we do have a decently strong resource here, but again, nothing like you're going to see in the plain states or the middle of the country. We have a very strong offshore wind resource here, which is very exciting. There have been utilities that have signed transactions, and we do see a lot of promise for offshore wind in this region. However, today it is still more expensive than signing onshore wind in the regions where wind resource is strong onshore. So this might be one reason that you think about where you site a facility, because ultimately the PPA price, the fixed price you're going to pay in your contract, is going to be driven by these factors. How expensive it is to build the facility, and how much output can you get for each turbine you put in or each solar panel that you install. Next slide. And this I won't harp on because this is what Henry already covered, but again, you're going to have a much different emissions impact depending on where you site the project. And that's based on what resources are currently running. We have a very relatively clean grid here in our ISO, which is great. But at the same time, we need to continue making it cleaner, but you can have a larger impact by going to other grids that have not caught up with us. Next slide. And this is going to look familiar. This is the dispatch curve that Henry showed. And what this means is, again, you're going to bring all of the resources online until you hit the amount of demand on the system. And so this is going to be constantly moving. And this sets the price in the market that everyone receives that has been dispatched, as well as it sets what's the marginal resource. And so in locations like New England, you're going to have natural gas maybe on the margin. In locations like the middle of the country, you might have coal on the margin. And so not only does that have an emissions impact, but it also has a cost impact. As you can see here, running a coal plant is actually on a variable basis. Each time you run the plant, more expensive than natural gas or renewables. This means that the price is going to be higher in the market. So it's almost kind of a backwards incentive, but in places that are dirtier, you tend to have higher prices in the market, which means that if you're doing a renewable energy transaction, not only are you getting an emissions benefit in that market, you're also going to be getting a higher price relative to your fixed price. So a better economic transaction as you sign a PPA. And I can explain that a little bit more on the next slide. So how a power purchase agreement works if you're doing a virtual power purchase agreement is that, as you see on the left-hand side here, you're continuing to buy your electricity from your utility. Nothing changes there. The same amount of electricity that you're buying from your utility, you're going to need to buy from a renewable energy facility to make the claims that you're either 100% renewable or whatever percentage you're going after. And so what you would do here, your business would sign an agreement with a developer to develop a wind or solar project. That developer will sell that power into the local electricity market, and they will get the price of power at the time they sell it. They will then give the RECs to your business, and you will do a swap of revenue streams. So you will pay the fixed price in the PPA for them putting that electricity into the grid, and you getting the renewable energy certificate to make the claim that that electricity went into the grid that was renewable. And you'll get back whatever the price of power was at that time. So that means on a net basis, you could be making money in the PPA, or you could be losing money relative to whatever the price is in the power market at that time. Let's go to the next slide. And this prices in these markets are set every 15 or 5 minutes. And so at the end of the month, you net out that exchange. And what that means is that you are looking for a power market in which you expect the power price in that market to be higher than the PPA price you agreed to in the contract. Typically that won't happen every month, but the goal there is to make that a net economic benefit to your organization, or at least be more economic than the alternative, which is to go out and buy RECs and just make that fixed cost to buy the RECs. So again, when companies, institutions think about where they want to purchase renewables, there's a lot of different factors to take into account. One is the emissions impact, another is additionality, but another, from an economic standpoint, is where am I going to get the most competitive PPA price relative to a higher wholesale energy price. And if you look at PPA prices in New England right now, you know, wind and solar can kind of be in the $40 to $55 range for an offsite PPA. If you're looking at on-site solar and wind, that will vary depending on if you're taking the project REC or not. But if you look at places like Texas, for example, the ERCOT market, you're going to be paying PPA prices in the teens or low 20s. And you may have, you know, very similar wholesale energy prices that you're comparing that against. Next slide. And so there's a lot of urgency right now for institutions to buy renewables, and largely that's because much of the economics of these transactions is driven by tax credits. So there's federal tax credits for both wind and solar. This top area describes the PTC, which is for wind, and the bottom section describes the ITC, which is for solar. And it's a complicated graph, but basically what it's saying is the incentive is stepping down over time. It's already started stepping down for wind, and it will start stepping down at the end of 23 for solar. So as this incentive steps down, the power purchase agreement price that the buyer will have to pay will have to go up until technology can catch up. And we've already seen that start to happen with wind. Wind has started to tick up in price when we run RFPs because they're now getting 80% of that incentive as opposed to 100% of that incentive. So I think, you know, no one has a crystal ball in terms of what's going to happen in Washington in the future, but if things don't change, we do anticipate that right now procuring renewables is a very strong time for corporates and universities to do that. And really, these transactions take quite a while to not only negotiate the PPA, but then have the project be built. So for example, we're working with clients right now for projects that will come online in 2023. So you do need to kind of think ahead of when you're looking to have your project come online, because there is a time period that will have to take to happen. Next slide. And I'll go through quickly these last points. If you want to go to the next slide. You know, I think we hear a lot of concern about, well, if I purchase a REC, you know, over in Texas or over in South Dakota or some other place in the United States, you know, how can I ensure that someone else isn't claiming that same renewable energy benefit if I'm not receiving that at my facility? And really, you know, there is a very transparent and clear framework. There are tracking systems. These are logos for the different tracking systems by region to ensure that if you are purchasing a REC, whether it's unbundled or with a PPA, that is your REC and no one else can claim that renewable energy attribute. Next slide. And if you're doing market-based greenhouse gas accounting, there's a hierarchy of how you can use different attributes. And so typically you would use your RECs and your PPAs to make your renewable energy claims. And from there, then you could look to the mix in your grid. But you do need to subtract out from that mix any other RECs that were purchased by other buyers. So there isn't a double counting there in terms of you know, just waiting to see how the grid mix changes. People that have purchased RECs in that grid will be able to claim those renewable attributes and basically take it out of the grid mix for what you're counting in your market-based greenhouse gas accounting. We spend a lot of time on this topic. We have experts at Edison Energy if anyone's interested in talking about that more, but just want to make the claim that there really isn't any double counting that's involved here. think that might be my last slide. And this is just some more information. So with that, I'll turn it back. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. And just a reminder to the participants, if you have questions for any of the panelists, please put them in the chat box so we can walk them through during the Q&A. And Dennis, I think you're gonna load up your slides and we'll get going to the next section.
Okay. Can you see my slides?
Not yet. There you go.
Okay, great.
We're good.
Super. Thank you, John. And thank you, Henry, Alison, and Kristen for all of the earlier presentations. I feel like this is really going to make my piece very easy. So in December 2017, Boston University's Board of Trustees approved an ambitious climate action plan to achieve net zero direct emissions for our operations by 2040. The BU Wind project that came online this morning represents the most impactful single step in achieving that goal. It will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 53% alone. According to the US EPA, Boston University's 205 million kilowatt hour power purchase agreement is the largest PPA procurement by any college or university participating in the EPA's Green Power Partnership, and second only in New England to Iron Mountain's 254 million kWh per year PPA. The climate action plan that the faculty-led task force delivered had 5 high-level goals. One was to prepare our campuses for the impacts from climate change that can no longer be avoided. Number 2 was to get to net zero direct emissions for our operations by 2040. Number 3 was to act on indirect emissions, those emissions that are not in our direct control, but result in what we buy, what we waste, and how we move. Number 4 was to integrate climate change into our curriculum and research better than we already do. And number 5 was to integrate the climate action plan into the university's strategic plan. The climate action plan, now I want to turn to how we will achieve net zero direct emissions for our operations by 2040. This graph is central to how we think about this work. The vertical axis represents our greenhouse gas emissions. The horizontal is in years. The shades of gray are the fossil fuel emissions from various sources. First, we will increase energy efficiency and reduce our emissions through efficiency 31% by 2032. We will source renewable energy to match 100% of the university's electricity demand, and we will shift from fossil fuel use to electricity over time for heating and cooling to enable the transition to renewable energy. And as we are doing with the Center for Computing and Data Sciences that is now under construction, and we discussed a few GRCx's ago. And we will begin to transition the BU fleet to electric vehicles. In January 2015, Boston University began to seriously explore the potential for renewable energy. At that time, the Green Ribbon Commission established the Renewable Energy Prize, or the Renewable Energy Purchasing Network that John mentioned earlier. That April, BU hosted the Renewable Energy Purchasing Network with Edison Energy and Customer First Renewables to help us flatten the learning curve. Mariela Puerto from the Barr Foundation, I really need to give a shout out to Mariela. This was a brilliant idea. She proposed at the end of that session that they establish a $100,000 renewable energy prize. And one of the requirements for that prize was to have a signed letter of intent for a large-scale renewable energy project in hand by December of that year. That was no small task. In August, the GRC held a workshop facilitated by Customer First Renewables to help organizations understand the risks and economics specific to their organizations. And from my perspective, as I said, Mariella's idea was brilliant. The GRC Renewable Energy Prize gave us a deadline, and I was able to use that deadline to focus our team, Edison Energy, and decision makers at BU to bring a project to the finish line, which we did. Unfortunately for us, at the time, we couldn't get that project to pencil. What we did do through that process, however, was to get our team up the learning curve very successfully, which made the process when we finally got this done much more easy. And so in September 2016, the Board of Trustees at Boston University asked the university to develop a climate action plan. As we developed the strategies to get to net zero, I brought the Edison team back to BU as we developed the criteria for a renewable energy project. We ran a parallel process. So by the time we presented the final climate action plan to the board, we knew the cost and risks associated with the renewable energy project. We had to do this project without raising tuition. We signed a power purchase agreement with ENGIE in July of 2018. Construction was completed last month, and this morning, BU began to buy power off of that project and will continue to do so through 2035. So let me walk you through how we ended up with a project in South Dakota. As Henry and Kristen have, some of what I'm going to be talking about is building on what they have talked about. The Climate Action Plan Task Force was led by Professor Anthony Janatas, a climate scientist and lead author on 2 national climate assessments and the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports. He emphasized the need to develop science-based criteria to maximize our impact on actual emissions reductions. First, we needed to match 100% of the university's electricity demand and do that as quickly as possible. Second was impact. We wanted additionality. We wanted to be responsible for the construction of new renewable energy resources that would not otherwise be developed. We wanted to maximize our greenhouse gas reductions. With Tony Janatos' lead, we focused our efforts on science-based decision-making. If we actually wanted to make a difference with renewables, we needed to find a project that would displace the dirtiest generation in the country. He reminded me regularly that not all RECs are created equal, as Henry has pointed out. RECs are a market mechanism with 1 REC generated for every megawatt hour of renewable electricity generated, and are not tied in any way to actual greenhouse gas impact. While this was a driving factor for us, every organization pursuing renewables really needs to establish their own priorities based on their own values. And for many, that will mean a project locally. We needed to match the economics of the project with the greenhouse gas reductions. So those 2 criteria were equally weighted, as was shown in one of the tables that Henry showed earlier. We wanted to make sure that the project got Green E certified renewable energy certificates so that we could validate our claims and make sure there was no double counting. As an institution of higher education, we wanted to make sure we had educational research opportunities for our faculty and students. And we wanted to make sure that environmental and health co-benefits were important to us. And we wanted to make sure that while any project is going to have an environmental impact, we wanted to make sure that this project would steward our environmental priorities. This is similar to a graph that Kristen and Henry both have shown. It shows the greenhouse gas intensity from the fuel mixes across the country. This one is a little bit out of date. This comes from 2016, but as you can see, New England generates very little greenhouse gases per megawatt hour of generation compared to the middle of the country. We're still generating. We looked at 170 projects in the 4 dirtiest grids in the country at the time. So with those 127 projects, 68 were wind and 59 were solar. 7 wind and 4 solar, we got it down to through using the EPA's eGrid to screen for greenhouse gas intensity and looking at the economics of the projects that we got from the bids we received. We then took those projects and got data from of the generation profiles of these projects from Edison Energy, and we compared that with the marginal emissions profiles for these grids that we got from Carnegie Mellon University. We did that analysis at BU. From there, we got down to 3 projects, 2 wind and 1 solar. We did a deeper analysis of the economics and the risks for these projects. We did our due diligence on the rest of the criteria, and we interviewed the teams. From there, we ended up with the project with ENGIE in South Dakota, and WattTime provided validation of our marginal emissions analysis, which was very critical for our process. I mentioned eGrid. These are the pie charts from eGrid. This is a EPA database. On the right-hand side, you see ISO New England with 577 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour of generation versus on the far left side, 1,482 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour of generation. So more than 2 times more greenhouse gas emissions just from the eGrid scan. And if you look at the pie charts, the green represents natural gas, which most of New England's grid is using to generate electricity, while coal in the Southwest Power Pool, where our project is located, is mostly coal. So we can expect 2 to 3 times more emissions reductions from a project located in South Dakota. I mentioned equally weighting the economics and the greenhouse gas reductions. This graph shows on the vertical axis the economics of the projects we looked at, and on the horizontal axis the greenhouse gas intensity. This graph was generated by Edison for us to help us compare these projects, and essentially we were looking for projects that are in the upper right-hand quadrant. And I'm not going to get into the weeds of how we went from there, but this is a pretty intense analysis. Essentially what we want to do is align the generation with the marginal emissions or the greenhouse gas intensity over time in the grid. This graph represents a 24-hour period with the greenhouse gas intensity in the Southwest Power Pool where our project is located. Ideally, we'd want to find a project that matched that so that it was generating the most electricity while the grid intensity is the greatest. That's obviously an idealized world. This is the curve that we ended up with the project in the Southwest Power Pool in South Dakota. This is a similar graph for one of the other wind projects. This one was located in Texas. As you can see, there's not quite as good a correlation. And then this was the best of the solar projects. And much to my surprise, the correlation wasn't there either. So we ended up with that project in South Dakota. This is a graph similar to what Henry showed with the projects we did the deep marginal emissions analysis on. This is the project we chose, essentially more than 2 times greenhouse gas intensity of a project located in New England. So let me turn to economics for a minute. As Kristen described, this is a contract for differences. We're buying at a fixed price, which is represented in the red with the red line, and we're selling it in the Southwest Power Pool at the floating price, which is represented hypothetically by that jagged line. This also provides a hedge on our greenhouse gas, on our gas purchase, natural gas purchase for heating, as well as electricity here in New England. And I will say that if we compare the PPA price that we got in 2015 through that process with the PPA price that we got in 2017 as we're negotiating this contract, there was a 45% reduction in that price. And now the project pencils. as I mentioned, we needed to do this project without raising tuition. And we believe that that declining production tax credit had a lot to do with that price dropping. So I'm pleased to report that the BU Wind project is now complete at NG's wind farm in South Dakota. Here's a quick video to give you a sense of the project. So why South Dakota and not New England? Because we wanted to find a project that would have the greatest impact possible on reducing actual greenhouse gas emissions. Since the climate doesn't care where our emissions reductions come from, we chose to find a renewable energy project that would displace the dirtiest electricity generation possible. Of the 127 projects in the dirtiest grids in the country, this one maximized our criteria and will displace 2 to 3 times more emissions than a project located in the greening New England grid. We will receive the RECs, the renewable energy certificates, from the project and retire them for the benefit of the planet. Here are some quick facts. There are 92 wind turbines in the project. The final one was completed in August. The tip of the blades sweep 500 feet above the ground. The project began to generate electricity for Boston University this morning. The project will match 100% of the university's electricity load. It will generate 205 million kilowatt hours of electricity a year for BU for 15 years. It will reduce BU's emissions by 53%. The project is located on 42 square miles of farmland in South Dakota, generating added income to the farmers who lease their land for the project, while generating clean power for BU, helping the university meet its climate action goals. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you,
Great.
John.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Yeah, thanks, Dennis, and thanks to all the panelists. I think this sequence just shows how complicated and strategic the decision making needs to be to get to where you want to go. I'm going to start off just asking Alison to clarify one thing related to this emissions performance standard that someone had a question about. Alison, this is related to the question of PPAs compared to the emissions factors in the ISO New England grid. Can you just sort of clarify where you guys are on that? Because I think that's important.
Sure, thanks, John. Good flag. So we are looking at right now PPAs that would be at least in grids at least as dirty as the ISO New England grid, or displacing at least as much emissions as the building would generate on our grid. So to the points that Henry and Dennis and Kristen made, we want to make sure that we're reducing emissions here as our top priority.
Okay. Great. We got a question here for you, Henry, and I'll just read it. It says, does BU get more carbon credits for buying renewable energy from somewhere that displaces dirty energy and or has positive health impact? Or are carbon credits calculated just on the green energy generated?
That's a great and complex question. So generally speaking, for the greenhouse gas protocol and accounting purposes, most of the calculations are done on a megawatt hour basis. So all the electricity is treated equally. So BU has essentially said, we could have built a project in New England and received the credit there. But because if we built it somewhere else, we'll reduce more emissions in the real world, we'll get more emissions benefit, real world emissions benefit, but the same accounting benefit. They're actually maximizing, they're kind of subverting the greenhouse gas protocol and maximizing the true global benefit of it, which is a clever way of achieving these reductions. I hope that was.
But they don't then in turn take the difference between those megawatt hours in ISO New England versus what they're getting out there and sort of add it as a credit to their inventory, right?
Not under the current accounting scheme, that's correct.
Okay, great. Another question, I think, Kristen, that gets to your presentation, and this is on the sort of contract for difference. Is it possible for BU to actually make a profit with PPA if the prices go in the right direction?
Yes, it is possible. So as you mentioned, it's a contract for differences. So it really is every month looking at whether it's above or below. I think the key thing we always talk to clients about is, don't enter this looking to make a profit. It's important to know the risks because it could go the other way, but a lot of economic analysis will help you understand how do we expect this contract to perform? And there is a lot of unknowns because these are typically 12, 15-year contracts and the grids are changing rapidly. So the economics of those grids are going to change with it. And so typically the way we work with clients is to do a lot of scenario analysis. Depending on how the grid could change, what would that mean for the economics and where do we think it will come out? But most clients are looking for it to be at least neutral. Most are not looking to lose money in the contract, although they have to understand that's a possibility.
Can I add to that a little bit?
Great, thanks. Yes, Dennis.
I lost my sound for a minute, so I hopefully I'm catching up here. But we did a really deep analysis on the economics that Kristen is well aware of. And we expect to be at least cost neutral over the 15 years. We certainly expect to be writing checks to NG, but we expect cash flow positive at times as well. I also want to make sure that people understand that there's a close correlation between the cost of electricity and the cost of natural gas, because natural gas is producing most of the electricity in the country now. So it's actually also performs as a hedge on our purchasing of energy here in New England.
Yeah, I would just add to what Dennis said, which was one of the kind of interesting things we learned with the Renewable Energy Purchasing Network is that when you do contracts for differences, and this sort of gets to organizational capacity, these end up actually being treated internally, ultimately, as a financial transaction and not an energy procurement transaction, which means there's a whole nother set of people in the organization, meaning the treasurer and CFO and other folks, who need to get involved in that process. And as a result of that, we actually pulled together a CFO roundtable of the institutional players just to help the CFO side of the house understand what these things are. But that was helpful for us to understand that. Alison, there was a question specific to you, and I think it maybe presumes an outcome that hasn't quite yet happened, and that is, how did you start the conversation about the building performance standard with the real estate and development community in Boston, and how did you get them on board to support it?
Well, yeah, so that is still actively in process. I will say that the real estate community and members of the real estate community have been active partners and collaborators throughout the process, from our earliest climate action plan through the technical analysis in Carbon Free Boston, through the update of our climate action plan, and into the detailed development of the performance standard. I'd also say that we've gotten a lot of very helpful feedback from them on the details of the performance standard and how they've learned from their interaction with the existing policy, which is BERDO, the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance, so that we can tune elements of that better match our goals that have evolved towards emissions reduction, as well as the standard. So we've also been very happy to have partners like the GRC, like A Better City, and other organizations that have helped us and their real estate members engage and support and develop the performance standard. So looking forward to that continued partnership. We know it will be challenging. It will represent a new way of thinking about emissions reduction and their portfolios. But together, we think we can find a way to make it the best version of that standard for Boston that we can.
Since I got you online, Alison, there's also a question here from a participant from New York State who follows community choice aggregation deals, with some concern that the history is that the opt-up model sometimes doesn't work, that people will predominantly select the default plan to be their choice, or if it's higher, a percentage will go back to the utility rates. Can you just respond to that and how you guys have been thinking about that and sort of accommodating that potential?
Sure. So we have, from following other aggregations, seen similar challenges. So on the one hand, that's why we think that it's important to spend as much to also try to be cost competitive with the utility rate, so that people don't want to go back to the lower renewable energy rate of the base rate, but to stay within the aggregation program. In terms of opt-up, that can be challenging. We see an opportunity here with a combination of the performance standard and CCE, where that will be opt-up will potentially be one of the easiest actions that an individual condo owner or individual rental tenant in a large building can take to help the building achieve its performance standard targets. And so that could align incentives within the building and the city and the tenant to all work together to achieve this goal. So we're interested to see how those two policies and programs interact with each other to potentially to move more people towards opt-up.
Great, thanks. So Dennis, I think this next question is probably for you, and it gets to the additionality question. And I'll just read it. It says, since wind is plentiful in South Dakota, how does BU know that this new generation wouldn't have been built anyway? In other words, how do you know this project achieved additionality? Can you just speak to that a bit?
Sure, that's a great question. I think the fact that the project was not able to move forward until we signed the power purchase agreement, that cash flow, that guaranteed cash flow for the developer for 15 years allowed them to get the financing they need to get the project built. And that didn't happen without us doing that. And
okay,
now it's
great.
online. So
now it's online. Another question related to emissions reduction is whether or not, now Henry, maybe this is a question for you. Do the emissions reductions measurement include any, I guess what you would refer to as scope 3, emissions created by the construction of the wind farm, the construction of the windmills, the installation, those kinds of factors? How does that factor into the calculation at all?
In this case, it is not included in the calculation. The embodied emissions, you could call it, in the wind farms are not included. In previous calculations we've done, we've seen a payback period where it displaces as much emissions as caused in the construction in less than 6 months. So it's a very quick, it reduces substantially more emissions through its operation than it causes through its construction.
Okay, great. Another question I think probably is also targeted at you, and which sort of gets into the level of precision that you have in the measurement of the actual emissions being displaced by a particular project and by the particular megawatt hours. What do you actually calculate those down to the megawatt hour for the project based on those kinds of factors that you laid out?
We do, and we use actual historical data. So we take actual generation and actual emissions because the EPA tracks stack level emissions for every generator in the US over 30 megawatts. So we take that data combined with actual profiles at an hourly granularity and say, when you see this change in load, what is the change in emissions? So if you were to add or remove a megawatt or more at a given time, what would be the corresponding change in emissions? And we're very careful to use empirical models, ones that are based in, rooted in the actual data, not assumption-driven models, so that we have confidence in those, in that data.
Great. I think what this is the last question, and Alison, it's it's to you, and it's an equity question, which is how in the way you're designing the ordinance do you take into account sort of equity and the building of incentives or resources for the buildings that will typically have fewer resources to invest in meeting the emission standards. Can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. So there are a couple lines here. The first is to make sure that members of environmental justice communities were represented and were able to participate actively in the policy development process, and they still are. We've been partnering with local community groups to have a residents advisory group that focuses on equity outcomes, hearing from residents about their priorities for their homes, their environment, and the outcomes and design of the standard. So we've been baking that into the process. Also, we understand that many buildings, particularly under-resourced buildings, will need additional support and help in understanding the targets and connecting to the opportunities and resources to help them decarbonize. So an example of the work we're doing there that will only continue to grow is the building retrofit resource hub that we've been developing to help buildings connect to those resources and get that assistance. We're also looking at one of the elements baked into the design of the policy. Obviously, we want buildings to be first taking action in the building to see those benefits in the building. But one additional option is an alternative compliance payment. And so we're looking at how we can use those resources that would come from the alternative compliance payment to reinvest into retrofits in priority and support for priority communities across the city. So those are three quick points I'd highlight there.
Great, thanks, Alison. And I want to end, Kristen, just ask one clarification of your presentation on community solar. I mean, the way you laid that out, as great as community solar projects are, the people who participate in community solar aren't technically buying renewable energy because the utility is retiring the RECs. Is that an accurate way of thinking about it?
Yes, so typically the transactions we've helped clients on, they get a replacement REC, so they still are able to make the claim that they're using renewable energy, but you cannot claim you're using renewable energy from that solar farm because the utility is doing that. I think the reason companies and institutions are still looking at it is you need the buyer in the PPA to show up for the utility to be able to implement the program. So you are helping to bring renewables on the grid, and that is having a real impact. But you're right, the nuanced claims are a little bit different because you're not getting the REC from that facility. You're typically getting a replacement REC.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. That exhausts all our questions. I just again want to thank Alison and Henry and Kristen and Dennis for taking the time and helping walk through this. It's a really important evolution in the city's climate strategy. And thanks to all of the rest of you who have been able to join us, and stay tuned for the next GRCx that's going to be coming in the new year. We think it's going to be something in early January on hydrogen and hydrogen pilot opportunities in Boston. We haven't quite nailed it down yet. So with that, we're going to close out, and thank you and have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.